Okay, I see a few early people here. I just wanted to welcome you to today's program. My name is John. I'm with the California Preservation Foundation. For those of you who are logging in early, I just wanted to point out the items you'll see on the screen right now are some information on how to manage things in today's program. If you prefer to use closed captioning, there's an option on the bottom of your screen. You could click the closed caption option and enable captioning if you prefer. If it's disruptive and you prefer not to have captions, there's also an option to hide those captions. I'm going to start the captions right now. So closed captioning is now on. Today's program will be an hour in length. We have plenty of time for questions, and as is usual, we suggest you use the question and answer box. In the question and answer box, if you see a question from another attendee that you'd like to see addressed, you can always upvote it. Click the thumbs up symbol next to the question, and that'll ensure that our moderator knows which questions are most requested for the day. We have about 150 participants today, so there might be a lot of questions. Usually we suggest you ask your questions as early as you can, whenever you think of it. That'll give our moderator plenty of time to digest all of the questions and direct them to our panel today. We have two panelists. You don't necessarily have to have read the book to be involved in today's program. If you have more of a general question, or if you have a question specific to an architect that's mentioned, feel free to ask that question. We don't require you to have read the book. Today's program will also be recorded in full. So if you'd like to access the recording after the program, you can always visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/calpreservation. You can go to our Facebook channel at facebook.com/capreservation, or you can find the video on LinkedIn or Twitch and watch the recording there as well. The program is generously supported by our sponsors. Our annual sponsors are listed on the screen right now. We wanted to thank and acknowledge our sponsors for their support of this free program. We're able to make programs available for free thanks to our members and to our sponsors and donors. So if you have any inclination, we encourage you to donate or join CPF if you aren't already a member, and we appreciate any support you can give. We'll start here in about 2 minutes. In the meantime, feel free to let us know in the chat box where you're from. I'm going to now enable chat for everybody. And let us know where you're coming from today. And we'll see you in about 1 minute here. We'll start in 1 minute. Welcome, everybody. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. I wanted to welcome you to today's program on the women who changed architecture. We have some panelists here who were closely involved in the book. As I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily have to have read the book, although we encourage you to order it. And in a moment, I'll paste in the chat box a link to order the book if you haven't already. My purpose here is just to quickly go over a few brief things, just so you know how to ask questions and be involved in today's program. We have about 150 participants today, so I wanted to encourage everybody to use the question and answer box, and our moderator will look at the Q&A box for any questions that come in. You can also upvote any questions that you see that you would like to be addressed first. Those questions will be sorted by the most upvotes. We also are making a recording of today's program, which will be available on our YouTube channel, our Facebook channel, LinkedIn, and Twitch. And with that being said, I wanted to welcome our Education Committee member, Helen Taco, who has been closely involved in organizing this program, and she'll be our moderator today. So welcome, Helen, and we'll get going right away.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am the Director of Architecture at GDX Group, and as John mentioned, I'm currently serving on CPF's Education Committee, and I am honored to be the moderator for the discussion of this important book. The Women Who Changed Architecture profiles the successes and challenges of 122 women architects, and it's the most comprehensive look at women in architecture around the world from the 19th century to today. On a personal note, for me, this book filled gaps in my knowledge that were definitely omitted from my own architectural education, and if you haven't had time yet to read the book, I highly recommend it. A little bit about the book and how it's structured. It's organized in chronological order by the birth of the architects, ranging from 1856 to 1979. It's divided into 6 sections, each of which has its own introduction. And I am pleased today to be joined for this panel discussion by 2 of the 13 contributors to the book. I will first introduce Lori Brown, FAIA. She is an architect and distinguished professor at Syracuse University, the author of Contested Spaces, Abortion Clinics, Women's Shelters and Hospitals, and editor of Feminist Practices, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Women in Architecture, and the forthcoming Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia of Women in Architecture, 1960 to 2015, co-edited with Dr. Karen Burns. She also co-founded and leads Architects, a gender equity architecture organization in New York. I'm also joined by Julie Eakin, who wrote 40 biographies in this book. She is an editor and writer who studied art history at Barnard College and has graduate degrees in architecture and the history of architecture from SciArc and the University of California, Berkeley, respectively. She was the senior editor of Architecture Magazine and the editor of Site, the Architecture Plus Design Review of Houston. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining me.
Thank you.
So we're going to be running this as kind of a panel discussion today. I'll be doing my best to keep an eye on the questions, as John mentioned. And we have a number of questions that we've prepared in advance. We will kind of go back and forth with our panelists and asking these questions in the discussion. And if you have questions to the guests, if you have questions that are pertinent to the discussion that's going on, feel free to sprinkle those in as well, and we will do our best to address those kind of as they go. So my first question is going to be for Lori, although we will also be asking this question of Julie, and that is, why do you think this book is important, and can you share something you learned by participating?
Thank you so much. And I also want to thank the California Preservation Foundation for the invitation to be a part of this. And I really look forward to hopefully a lot of questions that you all place into the chat so that we can be engaged and hear your thoughts. So yes, I think all of these types of books are incredibly important. For one, there's still not enough information about women's contributions to the built environment. And this book in particular, because of the time span it's covering, is particularly important. We don't often have that long of a time frame in some of these books. It's more contemporary, or it's focused primarily on the past. So I think to show that breadth is really important. I will say it was a pretty daunting task to be a part of the project, in part because I was invited and asked to write an introduction for my age group, which I also happened to be included in. So there was a double whammy of sorts, that not only do I have to create the kind of structure of my age group, but then there was the pressure of I'm also a part of it, and I wanted to make sure to do it justice for many reasons. And I would also want to mention that no list is exhaustive. So it's important to think about who writes these lists and how, what the parameters of inclusion are. And when I was writing my introduction, I had the list of people who were going to be included, but they were writing the entries or the biographies as we were writing our introduction. So I knew many of them, or knew of many of them, but I didn't know all of their work. So it was really trying to zoom out a bit and create a much broader picture of both the kind of political, economic, and social environment that my cohort is working within and being educated and growing up within.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. So same question for you, Julie. Why do you think the book is important, and can you share something that you learned from participating?
Sure. I think it's an important book on so many levels. I think acknowledging the contributions of all these people is sometimes a first, and obviously very meaningful to them. Many of them are educators, and that's a role that they consider part of their practice. So I think people considering architecture would benefit from reading this book. I think it does a great service to the profession in general. It outlines so many different trajectories, and rereading it, over the last days, I just felt excited about architecture in general and the places it might go to, to see the ways that people are interpreting it differently. I think a lot of people think of architecture as relatively straightforward, and I don't think it is at all. So that's something that is energizing about the book, I would say.
Great. So Julie, would you share a story or stories from a particularly inspiring architect who's featured? And this may be a good moment for me to share my screen, I think, if you were going to refer to any of those.
I think I'm going to talk about somebody that we don't have an image of.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation co-published this book with Princeton Architectural Press. And Beverly Willis was my first interview, and I think she was 92 when I spoke to her 3 years ago. She's still alive. And I didn't know who she was, and I had been interviewing architects for 20 years. So it was pretty much a revelation, but the interview was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I considered all of them just very lucky to be in touch with these people, in part because they were willing to share very personal things. And I think that when I'd interviewed a lot of architects previously, and most of them were definitely male, I didn't hear so much about their lives and how their lives had impacted their choices. And these women were used to talking in that way, and I found that really lovely. So Beverly Willis was separated from her family. She was from Oklahoma, but they were really so poor during the Depression they couldn't support her and her brother. So she went into an orphanage. And the way she talked about it, 90 years later, was just this incredibly seminal thing, basically she decided she needed to be independent, that she learned that lesson as a young person, she carried it throughout, and that is the way she conducted her business as well. And I thought that it made sense, but it was a little heartbreaking too. The story that I want to share in particular is about a software program she developed. She became a pilot at the age of 18. And so she knew her way around, flying in planes, and she knew of a computer program that allowed for accurate bombing. Later, when she started to practice architecture, she was looking at land development, and around San Francisco, she was really concerned because people were bulldozing the hills. And she wanted to figure out a way to talk about what was valuable and shouldn't be touched and what could be turned into something else. And she remembered this program from having been a pilot and bought the software and converted it, frankly. And then she sold that as a tool to other architects. So the idea that architecture could incorporate something like that, to me, was completely fascinating.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I'm so grateful that you brought up Beverly Willis, because I am so curious about her work and her life. And you know, I became aware of her also from reading this book. So I'm really grateful that you spoke about her. Lori, same question for you. If there was a story from an architecture featured.
Well, would you mind bringing up the slides, because I just want to highlight a few of the women in the demographic that I wrote the introduction for, because for me they provide a really important, thank you, array of types of practices. So the first is Georgine Theodore, who's she's also an academic and an urbanist and architect, and her engagement, particularly in underserved communities and the use of participatory engagement as a design tool, I find to be really critical in the way that Interborough Partners operates, and to try to find the gaps of need in communities, and then create often from small scale to larger scale interventions into urban fabrics that better serve the communities that they're working in. So I think that's a really exciting example of a more expanded practice. And then the next person I'd like to highlight is Upalali Nanda. And I included her because she's comes from practice, but also now is teaching in architecture and public health at Michigan. She's at HKS. And I'm particularly struck by the way that she's thinking as an architect about the end user, and that the end user's needs are so critical. And in some ways she talks about that the needs override or are more important than, say, the aesthetic choices. And that's not to say aesthetics aren't important, but for her to really think about the ways that design can serve the needs in healthcare, and teaching across disciplines through design and public health, I think is, for me, really important moving forward for the discipline, tackling some of the most challenges, some of the challenges that society is in need of response to. And the next person is Hannah Herringer. She has been working in India and Bangladesh, and she's particularly interested in local materials and local building customs from a historical perspective, and using those in a contemporary way, and working with local communities to build some of these structures. And so when we think about the climate crisis and the future of construction in different parts of the world, to really engage and use local knowledge as a means for material and spatial exploration, I think this is a really beautiful example of work that's doing that. And then the last person I'd like to highlight is Katie Newell, who is also, she is an architect and educator at Michigan. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight her, again, she's interested in material exploration, and in particular material reuse and reclamation, and how that she, in often unusual ways, creates these beautiful structures that preserve the integrity or materials that once were used for these barns and other houses in Detroit, in ways that were really unexpected and quite poetic. So I think that the merging of material exploration with such a poetic way to think through reuse of materials, I find quite inspiring as well. So thank you.
I'd be happy to add a few comments about some of these women. I talked to the last few. Katie Newell was the youngest person I talked to, Beverly Willis the oldest. And I was born in Detroit. I'm still in Michigan, but I'm in northern Michigan. And several of the people you mentioned are in Michigan, which I find really interesting. I think there's a good movement in Detroit that's exploratory and exciting. Katie grew up with a father and brother who worked in the plants, in the factories, and she thinks of her job as that kind of a job. She thinks of herself as a worker, and I think she really likes that concept in terms of the way she approaches what she does. Her father worked for her as well. The picture on the right, they deconstructed a building that had been victim to arson. And they took it apart piece by piece and then put it back together in a way to honor the people that had lost their homes and the people who live like this. Amelia Andreas, in the introduction, talked about a decentering and then a recentering that she sees occurring among women architects in this book, so that because they were on the sidelines, they had a pretty privileged view of what was going on. And then when they become more central in the profession, they get more power and are able to actually change it. But witnessing it and having the outside perspective, I think she talks about as being important. The other person, Anna Herringer, maybe we can go back to her. So building with mud is so appealing in the way that she's talking about it, because for one thing, it's very sensory. You know, it's a hands-on thing, and she teaches people from all different cultures. She's German, but lots of times she said they're not really speaking. They're making something together with their hands, and that is driving the design in part. She went to Bangladesh on a Fulbright scholarship, I believe, when she was 18, and that's when she got interested in the textiles. But another thing that she mentioned to me that was fascinating is that she was part of the restoration of a Gothic cathedral in Germany. They had to make a new altar. And instead of making marble, the parishioners got together and she guided them in making an altar out of mud. And everyone was blown away by how spiritual that experience was.
Very interesting. I think that's one of the things that struck me about this book too, is that, you know, I work in historic preservation. My firm is a development firm. I think I tend to have a very kind of in the box view of what architecture is, and I love that the women who are featured in this book, it's not just about the buildings that they have designed and built, but that it has, you know, textiles and mud and all of these other different materials and contributions that they've made that are included here.
Can I say one thing? Is it's so great to hear, Julie, your experience interviewing the women that you wrote about. And I think the role of biography is so important. And I think that's another distinguishing aspect of this book is so many of the women included who are still alive were interviewed. And that's rare, especially within architecture. I will say, working on the global encyclopedia, you know, we have over 1,150 women included. So there was no way that we could do that and the book ever come out. But, you know, looking at the way that women are written about in other disciplines, biography is really important. And it's also really a feminist mode of scholarship. So I think it's important to recognize how this book is doing something that most other architecture books have not done, which is the role of biography, the personal, which is also so revealing of their situatedness in the world, both economic, socially, and politically. And that says so much more than just, you know, what their accomplishments are. And I'll say that in quotes, because there's so many ways to create value in being an architect. But the biography is really important.
I agree.
Just hearing about some of the barriers that some of these women face, and Julie, you mentioned how Beverly was separated from her family as a child, and just some of the things that these women have overcome to accomplish what they did is very interesting. So I want to turn it back a little bit. So we are, of course, the California Preservation Foundation, and I needed to have a question in here about California. So the question is, how would you say this book impacted architecture in California? And I did a little survey myself going through the book, and you know, I think when I first looked at this book, I thought, oh no, how are we going to talk about this in the context of California? There are only a few of the kind of, you know, Julia Morgans and you know, the main women who we think of as having contributed to California. But then I went through and looked, and there were far more than I expected, and I've got tabs on all the pages here of women who have projects here in California, but also have taught at universities here or have won awards here and just have contributed in all different ways in California. And so I do think there's a lot of value here. And of course, we don't design in a silo and have a lot of influence from architects all over the world. So I think I will, Lori, if it's okay, I'll pitch it to you to add anything else you'd like to add to that, and I'll leave this slide up for now.
Sure. I really appreciated that you did that. I was not aware of, say, the impact that the collection of women included would have had in California. So that was fantastic to see. And I will say there was I can't speak specifically about many of these women in that regard, but I will say in other work that I've been a part of and looking at kind of the history of California and the role of women in that history in terms of architecture and design, I was particularly struck that women in California, for at least over the last 100 years, have been really significantly influential in the design fields. And I'll just mention a few. I mean, Julia Morgan, of course, is on the list, and that may be the most well-known woman from California that the broader public would be aware of. But then thinking about the Los Angeles Woman House exhibition, and there were many women-centered organizations that have been created, residency programs, educational buildings, artist colonies, even up until, through the environmental conservation movement, and even the creation of city parks, that those all have been instrumentally led initially by women. So women have had a huge impact on the built environment and the kind of movements that remain, and I think are going to even grow to become more significant through issues around climate. So that when I found that those materials in the past year, it was kind of amazing to realize that so many of the things that we may take for granted now were started in California by women.
I would mention too that Charles and Ray Eames, who I think a lot of people are familiar with, who are even outside the discipline, she did a lot. They were filmmakers and furniture makers and architects. I think she did a lot to raise the profile of women in California architecture. And I also want to mention, I did go to SciArc, and there were a number of these people who taught or lectured there. Deborah Burke came. I invited her actually when I was on the lecture committee, and I later worked for her. And she was so excited to come to SciArc. There was this real divide between West and East Coast education. And maybe that's still true to an extent. But I think the East is always happy to go West, and the West is always happy to go East and share what they're doing. Marianne Ray was one of my professors at SciArc. She and the late Robert Mangurian took students to Italy every summer to study Trajan's architecture and Hadrian's architecture. And I had a class called Built Rome, where we had to make tools, to measure things, and we weren't allowed to use computers, and on and on. So very tactile. I did interview Sharon Johnston and Julie Eisenberg, and they're big fixtures now in California architecture.
And I should add that this list is certainly also not comprehensive. These were the ones where their contributions in California were mentioned in the book, but I didn't have the time to go through absolutely every single person and search and see if they had any projects in California. So there are certainly probably others, and apologies if I've forgotten anyone on this list. So my next question is about historic preservation, because for historic preservation, we tend to focus on buildings that are 50 years and older, but we have more new buildings becoming historic every day as they hit the 50-year age mark and or become recognized for other reasons, whether it's the architect, cultural significance, etc. How do you think this book can impact how we view historic significance and identify these historic buildings? And Julie, I'll turn to you first for this one.
I will answer your question, but I had forgotten that I interviewed Adele Chatfield Taylor, who was heading American Academy in Rome. and very, very active in Landmarks Preservation Commission in New York for a long time. And she was incredibly interesting. So I wanted to point out that she's a preservationist. She found her way to it, as a young mother in New York who wanted to preserve the neighborhood that her kids were growing up in. And that's how she became involved with Landmarks Preservation Commission. But then once she was in Rome, of course, she renovated the structures there, and talked about how very, very difficult that was. Because they wanted to make them modern enough that they were comfortable for people, of course, and they wanted to preserve stories, and that's the way she put it, places where things happened that you wouldn't have known about, where there is no plaque. And I really love that idea that stories have the kind of value that warrant preservation in these physical objects. Places where people met, people had important discussions, that type of thing. That interests me a lot about preservation. And I think architecture is big enough to absorb those kinds of things. So you're asking me about preservation, and I'm thinking immediately about materials, I suppose. And I'm thinking about how Jean Gang, who basically transformed skyscrapers, mostly beginning in Chicago, she's building a terminal at O'Hare right now using street trees. It's all wood. So she's using the trees that would have been thrown away and were damaged and considered, not usable, to make this extraordinary, 700,000 square foot, terminal at the busiest airport. And she talked about the idea of transforming the concept of an airport, that most of them talk about flight, when in fact, everybody spends most of their time on the ground. And she felt that wood was something that was much more comfortable than metal if you're going to be around it for a long period of time, which she thinks weary travelers are. So I just think about that in terms of preservation, because a lot of people are building with wood now, and it's considered really sustainable, if it's done properly. I guess my idea is that part of preserving is also taking care of the materials, for instance, planting forests and that sort of thing, to make sure that it will be renewed. So it's a material regeneration as well. I don't think that's directly what you asked me, but that's what I'm thinking about.
I love that concept too, that the architects of today are designing the historic buildings of tomorrow. And that, I just realized I still have the list up on my screen, but that this list, amongst others, will be the architects of those future historic buildings.
And the skyscrapers that Jean Gang is doing will be historic buildings. And that's kind of wild to think about. But I know she's thinking about that and making her decisions.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Lori, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I want to kind of flip the question or expand the question a little bit, because I think similar to you thinking about architecture in a very, say, straightforward way, maybe I also have thought about historic preservation in a very straightforward way. But one of the things your question made me think about is, there's the physical object itself, but then there's also the historic things that happen. And there is efforts through the National Trust for Historic Preservation to mark where women have made history in this country. And there's efforts underway that have been underway for a while to mark these spaces, which in some cases may be considered not exceptional architecture, but spaces where these things have happened. So homes or spaces of meeting, or parks, to give you, a few examples. So I guess when I would want to also expand the way we think about what is historic and what do we value as a society to mark the evolution of, say, women's agency and power in our society, and that buildings and spaces are one thing, but where certain events happen are also as important, and they happen in space. And so to mark these are also really important for the legacy and future, to recognize how far we've come from over 123 years ago, which is the period that this book is looking at. So I think the parameters could be wider, maybe.
That's actually a really good segue into the next question, which is a question for you, Lori, which is, how does the book reveal how architectural practice has evolved, and what types of changes are shown through this chronology?
So I want to, in order to answer this, I think it's important to provide just a brief blip of history, so that we're aware of the kind of cultural and political context that even over the last 100 years, women's lives have been significantly changed. So if we think about this time frame, white women gained the right to vote only in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Chinese American women were not granted this right until 1943 with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the ability to naturalize by 1952. Native American women were not granted this until 1948, and Black women not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, respectively. So women's race and class and economic level is pivotal when we think about what this book is revealing. And so to catalog women through this chronology is really important to understand the massive changes that this book is showing, and their practices were embedded in and responded to. I know, speaking more from the section that I was creating the introduction for, I think there's, in many ways, women have been contained by or limited by some of these parameters, of course. And I think one of the things I thought that was pretty interesting in the latter part of the book was how, as some of these things expanded far more, apparently the way women were practicing also reflected this kind of expansion, and that these kind of hybrid situations between academia and practice, or practice and industry, or academia and industry, have helped create very fruitful and exciting opportunities that move between these different realms. And this is not to say this wasn't happening earlier, but I think those would be seen as far more exceptional within the kind of confines of their status with race, class, and economics, where today, although those things are still very much a part of how we're operating and restrictive in many ways, there's a bit more fluidity and crossing between them. And so the women in the last section of the book, I think, really show a very diverse way that's exploratory, that may not lead to buildings per se, but is engaging in space. It could be in technology and material exploration. So I think for me, the book, like seeing this chronology over the 123 years, really shows the evolution of how women were coming into this, the spaces that were changing all around them, and that they were pivotal in creating these changes as well. So I'm not going to highlight specific ones, but I think that chronology really, for me, helps set a broader understanding of this evolution of how women practiced and fought for practice and charted new territory in practice.
I want to piggyback, quickly, because Billy Chen is up here right now, and I think this might speak to something that you're talking about, Lori. One of the things, she has a practice with her husband, Todd Williams, and she's Chinese American. She and Todd Williams are designing Obama's library in Chicago, and they worked very closely with him the summer that I was talking to her. And so she was spending hours with him every week, and apparently he had a real interest in architecture and a certain amount of knowledge. But I think part of what she wanted me to understand too is that he understood her in a way that other clients maybe hadn't before, in terms of her having to have worked a little bit harder maybe to get the recognition that she's finally getting. And the fact that he chose, a male and female architect is interesting and curious, and I think makes sense. The other thing I wanted to mention about Billy Chen is that she worked closely. Well, she works. I'm sorry. She teaches at Yale, and when Deborah Burke became the dean at Yale, she wanted me to know how hard that was for her to have done that. That Deborah didn't speak about that, but that finally she felt like that school, Billy Chen said this, was more open to other voices than male white voices. And she'd seen a difference in the work as a result of Deborah having become the dean.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I've got one more question, or at least one more question, and I do see we've got a few that have come in from participants. So everybody feel free to put those questions in, because we'll be getting to those in just a minute here. And also, I just wanted to say I'm watching the chat, and there was a kudos to Jean Gang, which I love, and this chat is just making me smile right now. So to the panelists, I hope you have a chance to check it out at some point here. So my next and near final question is, how can this book influence professionals? And this one is for Julie. And I don't know if this is the point where you wanted me to flip to any of those, the women architects that you had slides for.
Sure. I'm sorry. I was just reading the chat.
Oh, no problem. Sorry, I distracted everyone.
Can you repeat your question again to make
Oh,
sure?
sure. It's how can this book influence professionals?
Okay. Yes. Let's look at Yasmin Lari, if you can.
Mm-hmm.
So Yasmin Lari is in Pakistan. She's in her 80s. And she started off with a very corporate career. I think she came from money. And so she took a traditional route. She was schooled in London, as I remember. And she built she designed two buildings in Karachi that were corporate headquarters. I think that it was an oil and gas company, and another building. So she liked what she was doing, but an earthquake occurred in 2005, and 80,000 people were killed in Pakistan. And she needed to help, and the work that she was doing, she didn't feel was the right approach. So she felt very strongly that people should be able to build their own homes, make their own homes, that maybe she could extend, her learning to these people with local materials. These people had no money. She said that the government was so corrupt, there was no way that the money would ever get to them. So I would just want to point out, again, your practice can be as big as you envision it as an architect. The slide on the left is a stove. It's an oven, actually. And these ovens existed, for people who are cooking their own food all the time, and they were getting burned, and they had their eyes removed from the smoke. They were catching on fire all the time. And so she decided to design a better, safer oven. And I guess there are 40,000 of these now. And one thing that occurred when she did it is there was flooding, and she raised them off the ground so that they wouldn't succumb to the water. And when she raised them, she said she actually raised the stature, not knowing that this would occur, of women in these societies, because people recognized what they were doing. They could see what they were doing, and they had to see what they were doing. At any rate, she just did a 180 and turned architecture into what she thought it needed to be for her people, which is extraordinary. So that's one example of, I would say if the ideas about architecture interest you, then you become the kind of architect that exploits those ideas that you care about most. And I have to say, I wish I'd had a mentor when I was in architecture school who had made me feel this way. When I talked to Harriet Harris, who's at Pratt, I thought, oh, she's younger than me. I wish she had been my teacher, because I needed to know that there were so many other ways. And when I interviewed these other people, in Israel and Spain, all over the world, it wasn't so much news to them, I don't think, that architecture was so many different things. I think they were more comfortable with that concept. That's the feeling I got. So let's look also, I can't remember, Julie Eisenberg. Let's look at her. She's in Los Angeles, and she's specializing in schools. Koenig Eisenberg, she's Australian, and she and her husband have had a practice mostly in LA for, I think, 30 years at least. And so this school, I think, is called Geffen Academy. So it's definitely paid for by David Geffen, big Hollywood person. And it's an existing building. It was a renovation. It was a pretty decent building, but it didn't serve the needs of kids in the future. And what they decided was that they needed a lot more transparency. I mean, literally. So students and faculty can move around closely. They can see what each other are doing. The faculty lounges are open. They're not inviting the students in, but they're showing them that there's not such a division. That was one thing that they created that was meaningful. The other thing they did is they have libraries around this space that are curated by different editors and specific to course material, but really offbeat and interesting. So kids can just go and pick up, like you would in your own library at home, a book off the shelf. They see what other kids are doing. They're interested, they're exposed to things that they're not necessarily studying, because they believe that kids will pursue what they're interested in, not what they're told to be interested in. So she wants, and she believes, Julie, that it would be important for commissioners and people who are hiring the architects to really have a long-term relationship with these people so that they can talk about the evolution of education and not hire somebody new to do a different building all the time, which I thought was very interesting. And so their practice changes. She also talked about the idea that they design housing and houses, and they use a different toolkit, but it's all the same impetus, the same purpose. So that's for people who can't afford expensive houses and for people who can afford extremely expensive houses. And she feels comfortable doing both.
Lori, would you like to add to that? How can this book influence professionals?
I don't have specific examples, but I think one of the things it does is that it shows such a wide array of scales of practice that demonstrate, as we've said previously, the kind of the diversity of types of work women have been involved in over the last century. So I think it provides examples for others to look at, and women who are doing this work. I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but it made me think of that comment made by Mitt Romney, the binder's full of women, like, oh, there aren't enough women, we don't know women. Well, it's like, here is a book that has incredible women's work that everyone needs to be aware of. And so I think I would want to say it's not just professionals, but it's also the academy, and like, who are we teaching students about? So this book needs to be included in architectural history courses and design courses. So there's just a much broader series of examples of the types of practices women are participating in, beyond that canon that were exposed to in our architectural history courses. So I think it benefits the discipline at large to have this kind of breadth of knowledge and the diversity of types of projects at your fingertips to be able to look at and find inspiration from.
So there's actually a question that I think sort of ties into this, and I'm going to start jumping into the questions from the participants now. We have a question. Would you suggest that women in architecture focus more on experience and function?
I think, I'm not quite sure why women should be the ones who would do that. I think all architects need to be thinking about this. I think it's, who are we serving and what are their needs? And I think that's the profession at large. It's not, there's no gender associated with that. So I think it's all of us need to be thinking about both experience and function in order to make responsive and good architecture.
I think the redefinition of function would help to express that experience is part of the success of a building as well. How well does it function, in many ways, can be how well does it serve people, right?
So we also got a question. I've got two more, and we do have some more time. So if folks have additional questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. A question: do any of the architects take into consideration what happens to the building materials after the building is torn down, and then in parentheses, the reusability of the materials, which I think is interesting. Julie, you were talking about the wood that was being used in one of the projects earlier. I feel like this ties in, but I don't know if there are additional examples that that either of you would like to bring up.
I'm thinking of, and it's also wood, it's cross-laminated timber. Yeah. So I think it's Allison Brooks, and it was an event piece. It's called Smile, and it's a sculpture that is shaped like the bottom of a bowl and it tips. And she's a huge advocate of cross-laminated timber. So, I mean, that's used material, that's become something else. But what I've been hearing about is that the Netherlands is proactive in terms of politics. They're hiring people who insist on reusing materials, like 70% of them, in the recreation of new buildings. And so there's this new discipline that is about dismantling and deconstruction and doing it properly with the insurance that it becomes something in the future. That would be a remarkable thing, if it proves to be really successful, and it would have to prove economically successful for us to adapt. But apparently there's a big willingness there to do that.
Yeah, I'd heard that too, and driven more by clients maybe initially than by architects, but the architects are embracing this wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think you're right, the clients. And one thing about this book is how people talked about the clients so many times. And I would say when I interviewed people in the past for magazines, they weren't talking a lot about the clients. They were doing their own thing, and the client was lucky to have them in some way. Mm-hmm. But the clients here figure prominently, which is, of course, the way it should be.
Another project, so Georgine Theodore, who I had highlighted, their PS1 contribution, all of the things they made were because they had engaged with community members and partners to see what was needed. They created these objects within the installation of PS1, that what you see on the right, that would eventually be given to these organizations at the close of that summer, and they would be able to be used for their organizations moving forward. So it was it was a beautiful way to not only reuse materials, and they have multiple lives after, but that these were kind of a catalog of objects were created specifically in response to community needs that then were curated in the courtyard of PS1 during that summer event. But the bigger goal was that they would be used and given back and given to the organizations afterwards. So I just really thought that there was such a poetics to the way that there was multiple uses, that they would have lives after the event, and that they prioritize community needs in order to do this project. So I think it's a great example of how this can operate in a kind of longer term way.
It's Very interesting. I think they even said they designed a ping pong table, which I don't see in the picture, but I'd love to see a photo of their ping pong table that they designed. And
Right.
John did pop into the chat a link to the sculptural piece that that Julie was referring to, that smile piece, if anybody wants to go take a look at that.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, John, for doing that. We have one more question that came in from the public, and it's a question about a specific architect, Henrietta Dozier, and I apologize if I am not pronouncing that correctly. This person says she was trained at MIT in the first decade of the 20th century and practiced in Atlanta and Jacksonville, Florida. She was her great aunt, though she died before she was born. The family is very proud of her. So thank you, Cornelia, for submitting that question. And I don't recall, although I am certainly not the expert here, I don't recall seeing her featured in the book. But I was wondering, you know, Julie and Lori, I'm not sure if you were part of the process of selecting who was chosen for the book, or if you had any insights on, you know, who's included, who's excluded, and maybe there needs to be a volume 2 for the book. So, but I wanted to raise that question since it did come in here.
I will say that I got that question from people the whole time that I was doing this. And no, I came on afterwards. It was Jan Hartman, the editor, who was at Princeton, of people who worked there. And Amelia Andreos was huge because they already knew that she would write the intro. And I do think that that's exactly the right answer, that volume 2 ends up making up for not having included people that should be in here.
And similarly, I received the list. I had no involvement in the creation or curation of that list.
Oh, I'm looking forward to volume 2 then. There were
We'll have to let Jan know.
Yes, yeah, let Jan know. We we can send her suggestions. I'm not sure if she would appreciate that or not, but yeah, there were a few names of folks in California who came to mind who I noticed were not included here, but I just, you know, assumed they didn't make the cut for whatever reasons. But thank you for your clarification on that. And so I guess with that, it's 12:53. I wanted to see if either of you have any closing thoughts or anything else that you'd like to mention that we haven't already discussed as part of the conversation.
I just would want to reiterate how important books like these are, and in particular because architectural history, well, 2 reasons. Architectural history is still incredibly exclusionary and has to be opened up more. And I think we have a lot of historians who are working in these ways, but it has to keep going. And I think the energy behind this book and other books that have come out in the last several years are really important in helping to do that. And the other part is that the broader public, we need to help educate and raise awareness of these women and women's contributions to the broader public. If you ask, you know, a person on the street, they may have heard of Frank Lloyd Wright and Zaha Hadid, but I'm not sure how many other architects they would be aware of. So I think we all need to make more effort in educating the broader public about the contributions that our discipline makes, because it's, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but the built environment is so critical. And at least where I live, there's really uninspired pieces to the built environment, more so than inspired. So in order for this to change, the greater public has to understand the value of what we do. So I think these books are, and the kind of mass appeal this book has, I think also is really important, that it's not strictly for the discipline or the profession, but it has the ability to cross market. And that's really important in terms of raising the awareness of architecture and women in architecture.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that a lot of architects bemoan the fact that most people will never go into their buildings, that their buildings tend to attract people who have access, who have more access. And I know that a lot of people are trying to figure out how can everybody have access to great architecture, because it's so life-changing to be in spaces that are meaningful. So I think that's a puzzle that people are working on, and can only get better.
I appreciate that optimism. And I will say I currently live in a very uninspired neighborhood of buildings. So oh, sorry. Encouragement from a coworker. So I think on that note, we will go ahead and wrap it up. I wanted to thank both of the speakers again. Thank you so much for your time and this very interesting conversation. And I wanted to say, John did add a link to purchase the book in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to get the book, read it, you can grab it from that link in the chat. And please do. It is worth the time that it takes to get through it, I will say. And I just want to say thank you again. Thank you, John and CPF, for hosting a conversation on this important topic. And this will hopefully be one of many more about women in architecture.
Thank you very much, Helen. I just wanted
Thank
to
you,
mention,
Helen.
yes, thank you, Helen, and thank you to both of our panelists today. It was really insightful for me. And on the note of access, which Julie talked about in her closing remarks, I wanted to paste a link to our program Doors Open California coming up in about a month. And that program is, I believe, a great way for people to access our state's best architecture, including many works of architecture by women. So thank you both again. And I wanted to encourage people to leave feedback on today's program by visiting californiapreservation.org/e. Let us know how we all did today, and I'll share that with our speakers. So have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, everyone.